and the traffic to get here. We're hoping more people will manage to get here in the next few minutes. I'm Fabian Zuleeg. I'm the Chief Executive of the European Policy Center, and we're very glad that we can host such a timely conference. I want to express my thanks for the partnership and support of the US mission to the EU, which has helped us to organize this. And I think it's clear these are indeed very challenging times with trouble spots all around the world. And it is an issue which I think particularly here in Brussels we know is not only something which happens far away. Terrorism has brought the security threat very close to home. In such a challenging environment, cooperation is crucial. Trans-border challenges cannot be solved by one country on its own, and working together offers the only realistic avenue to make progress. That does not mean we always agree on everything, and there are many issues where opinions and approaches differ, as we've seen in recent weeks. But that should not lead us to lose sight of the long-standing strategic relationship between the US and the EU that will remain crucial in the coming years. In the end, friends and allies can and should agree and disagree, discuss and contemplate their shared objectives, but also the areas where they might differ. For us, this conference is a very important contribution to this dialogue, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Whitney Baird, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary in the US Department of State, to say a few welcoming words. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the EPC, particularly for the long partnership we have shared here. And I would like to first excuse myself to you. I have a little problem with pollen and allergies, and I hope that my, my voice will hold out. For decades, the EU has been a close partner for the United States on a host of international security, economic, diplomatic, and humanitarian efforts. The United States is grateful for the indispensable and enduring partnership it has with the European Union, and we are stronger because of it. Together, we share a deep-seated economic and political partnership rooted in the shared values of freedom, democracy, and respect for the rule of law. Together, we make the world more secure and stable by strengthening border management, protecting intellectual property, promoting cybersecurity, and holding aggressive state actors such as Russia, Venezuela, and North Korea accountable through targeted sanctions. Together, we are addressing humanitarian crises, such as in Syria and Libya, and the needs of the most vulnerable by countering smuggling and building the capacity of law enforcement and judicial officials around the world. Together, we are fighting terrorism, pushing back ISIS in Syria, striking Assad's illegal chemical weapons program, and countering violent extremism within Europe and beyond. Together, we strengthen our economies and serve as central drivers of the global economy. After all, economic security is national security. Together, we look forward to continued decades of shared security and prosperity. The discussions today centering on cooperation between the EU, NATO, and the United States are important conversations to have. We support European efforts to increase defense spending and build stronger military capabilities. Any EU action should, of course, be complementary to NATO and avoid duplication. Enhancing military mobility in Europe will allow ease of movement of US and allied forces throughout Europe. This will help ensure the alliance can respond quickly and decisively when needed. But security comes at a price. Many of the NATO allies have been working tirelessly to achieve the agreed-upon 2% GDP defense spending requirement, but others need to do better. NATO and the EU complement each other in the fight against terrorism. Increased information sharing and cooperation will build our capacity and effectiveness to address the varied and evolving terrorist threats. We must continue to enhance our cooperation, not only in counterterrorism responses, but also in addressing online recruitment and the root causes of violence. The EU and NATO are both valued partners in the Defeat ISIS coalition. With nearly all of the populated territory ISIS once held across Iraq and Syria liberated, the coalition continues to track and combat ISIS cells globally. The JCPOA was agreed with the hope that it would lead to improvement in Iran's behavior in other areas, but this has not happened. Instead, Iran's behavior has become more aggressive, threatening the United States and our interest under the cover of the deal. We worked long and hard to come to an agreement and could not, but it is clear that we will continue our discussions. Another most urgent topic of discussion on today's agenda is instability challenges in Eastern Europe, including continued Russian aggression and attempts at division. The United States, our EU partners, and NATO allies and partners recognize the threat posed by Russia. We are focused in part on countering Russian efforts to undermine democratic institutions and the transatlantic partnership. We have been clear with Russia that this activity is unacceptable and it will not be tolerated. The coordinated transatlantic response to the poisoning of the Skripals in Salisbury sent a strong message that Russia's dangerous and destabilizing behavior will be met with real consequences. Ukraine remains a top priority for the United States. Our support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and political sovereignty is unbending. Through 4 years of Russia's aggression, the humanitarian crisis in eastern Ukraine has steadily worsened. Since 2014, over 10,300 Ukrainians have been killed. 3.4 million are in need of humanitarian assistance, and 1.5 million have been displaced. The United States, in close partnership with France and Germany, strives for peace in the Donbass, but Moscow has not shown any willingness to end the conflict. From the beginning of the conflict, the United States and the EU have stood united in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ending the conflict and solving the humanitarian crisis depends on Moscow calculating that peace is more beneficial to Russia than war. U.S. and EU Donbass-related sanctions must remain in place until Russia pulls its forces out of eastern Ukraine and fully implements the Minsk agreements. Our Crimea-related sanctions must remain until Russia returns the peninsula to Ukrainian control. Coordination between the United States and the EU is vital to protect and secure our citizens, especially when confronted with Russian-backed disinformation aimed to confuse and manipulate our citizenry. It hurts our collective efforts and sacrifices made to discourage Russia's bad behavior when some countries support commercial activities that provide the Kremlin with billions of dollars to build a gas pipeline like Nord Stream 2. We oppose Nord Stream 2, as do many, but not all of our European allies, as it would undermine European energy security, provide Russia a political tool to exert pressure on Ukraine and others, and present additional security challenges in an already tense Baltic Sea region. We welcome the efforts of our European partners to scrutinize all aspects of the project, including geostrategic and national security concerns. We support the Commission's proposed amendment to the Gas Directive, and we hope that the Council can adopt its general position on this file in the very near future. Our opposition to Nord Stream 2 is not about opposing Russian gas exports to Europe. We expect Russian gas will continue to form an important part of Europe's energy supply. Our policy is to support the EU's own efforts to strengthen Europe's energy security through diversification of country of origin, path of delivery, and fuel type. I look forward to hearing more from the esteemed panels of experts from Europe and the United States who have joined us here today. And I thank everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this important conference on security. Thank you very much.
Very well. We are ready to start our proceedings after these important introductory remarks. And we're going to lay straight into the security and defense debate. In this first session about defending Europe, about defense policies, the approaches of the EU, of NATO, of the US. Now, I guess that a sound defense policy starts with a sound assessment of our strategic environment, a sound assessment of the threats and the challenges that we face. We know that Europe's strategic environment has been growing much harder and more challenging over the last few years. There's been those who have spoken of a circle of fire around Europe. There is an interconnection of all the new crises piling up. There is geopolitical tensions and competition. Some old issues are still there, and new issues have come to the forefront. So it is a fluid strategic landscape, and one that requires clearly a lot of attention, constant update of threat assessments. And what I think is interesting to start with is to ask our panelists, how do they see this strategic landscape evolving? How do they see what is their perception? What is their assessment? And whether this perception has also sort of brought about a further degree of convergence between respective perceptions in Europe and the US, or whether there are also some differences in the way in which we perceive the evolution of this strategic landscape. You have the short bios of our panelists in the conference brochures, and you certainly know them given their prominence in European and transatlantic debates. We are delighted that you are with us to share your insights. And perhaps I could start with Ambassador Vershbow. How would you address this question?
Okay, well, thanks, Giovanni, and thanks, first of all, to the EPC and to U.S. Mission EU for organizing this conference. It's timely because there are a lot of differences emerging in transatlantic relations on specific issues, but at least on the issue of European defense and NATO, I think the Trump administration, despite lots of confusing signals at the very beginning, has demonstrated continuity overall in its approach to the alliance and its commitment to maintaining at least the core element of the transatlantic relationship. And I think on the question of threat assessments, again, while there may be differences of emphasis, which often reflect geographic location of one country or another, overall, I would say the threat assessments converge more than they diverge. And I think that's especially the case since 2014, when Russia launched its aggression against Ukraine and basically tore up the whole international rule book. But I think even before 2014, there was generally common ground. The threats were seen as more beyond Europe than in Europe up until then. despite some of the negative developments in relations with Moscow, going back to 2007, the suspension of the CFE treaty, Putin's famous speech at the Munich Security Conference, Russia was still seen as a partner, a difficult partner, but still part of a broader European security system. And the emphasis was on dealing with threats from beyond, terrorism, proliferation, instability in the Middle East and North Africa. All that, of course, changed in 2014 with Russia using its conventional power combined with hybrid warfare to illegally annex Crimea and to foment unrest in eastern Ukraine. I think all allies rallied around collective defense, again, as the core mission of NATO, went back to basics, as we said, with the decisions taken at the Wales Summit in 2014, the Warsaw Summit in 2016, reflecting the fact that we now could no longer exclude the possibility of a war with Russia in Europe, but perhaps more difficult to deal with the possibility that Russia would continue to use its hybrid toolkit to destabilize Europe, to divide NATO and the EU, and to try to kind of discredit democracy itself. 2014 was also a watershed year in terms of threats from the south with the declaration of the caliphate by ISIS. So I think since that time we've seen a common threat assessment, and it's been reflected in a common series of decisions taken at the succession of NATO summits to deal first and foremost with the Russian threat, but also to pay more attention to instability along NATO's periphery and to try to come up with ways to go to the root causes of that. I think NATO has been less successful in meeting the challenges from the south, but I think it's not a problem of a common assessment, but a problem of allies not having the political will or the resources to tackle the full spectrum of threats from the south.
Thank you very much. So 2014, a critical year, both to the east and to the south, collective defense back on the agenda. At the same time, the difficulty of dealing with situations of instability and deepening instability in the southern neighborhood. You mentioned the sort of wide spectrum of instruments that can be used in terms of security challenge, conventional, non-conventional, their combination into so-called hybrid threats and challenges. Perhaps, Gustav, what is your sense of how this landscape has been changing over the last few years?
Well, also thank you for the invitation, Giovanni, also to the U.S. mission, to the EU, for the opportunity to be here today. I think that a lot has been said already on many of the challenges that we face. And of course, it's very clear that we have a more contested world. There's no lack of issues that we need to deal with. And I think what is very interesting then to think about is what are the implications of this? And of course, one of the big takeaways is that the concept of security has widened very rapidly over the last few years. So what this means for us, both in the United States and in Europe, is that there is a premium on understanding the linkages across different areas. So perhaps before we had the luxury of trying to deal with issues on a more stovepiped basis. You could deal with a challenge in a specific geographic region. You could maybe deal with a functional issue in a more isolated way. And I think that's not possible anymore today. And to maybe illustrate that, I think if you ask many people what are some of the big challenges that we don't think about today that are on the horizon, one of them that many mention is the strong rate of urbanization. And of course, to many of us, this is a good thing. Urbanization is supposedly a good thing. It's good for economic growth. But many others argue that this is bad because we have a difficulty managing megacities. We may have challenges with air pollution. It's very interesting that the WHO came out with a report, as it does almost every year, indicating the large number of people that are dying early because of pollution, most of it in cities. I think the number was about 7 million that they estimate on a yearly basis. This is something that we don't always think about. The fact that in many cities, people are living in closer proximity to animals because of urbanization also means that there may be higher risks for zoonotic disease. So these are the types of things that I think are critical now, that we try to see the linkages. So climate change, what does that mean for food security? What does that mean for water security? What does that mean for the movement of people? So I think that would be something very useful for us to try to gain more understanding of the links across these challenges as early as possible, because that leads me to my second and final point, which is that I do agree that there is convergence in recognizing that we have a more challenging landscape. But maybe one of the issues is that we may, and when I say we, I'm now talking about transatlantic, the United States and Europe, we may have different ways of addressing some of these issues. And I think both sides, in fact, most of the international community tends to agree that collaboration is essential to address most of these challenges. So if we can have agreement on the tools and mechanisms as early as possible, that would be a very good thing. So I think that that will be some of the issues that we need to emphasize more. And of course, there's some issues where we may have completely different views. I think that the issue of climate change is one such example, where we may have different views on how critical an issue that is. And that raises, of course, the issue of how we prioritize among these challenges. But maybe that will be something to discuss later.
Thank you, Gustav. We'll certainly get back to the question of priorities, not least because you sketched out a broader, shall we say, security agenda. I think it's very important that you stress the way in which we have to look at the linkages in between the many distinct challenges that we face. There is a larger scope for defense and security policy, but then part of the difficulties is to connect the dots, actually. That also applies to the sort of more traditional military threats and dimension, to see how conventional, non-conventional tactics interact. And by the way, something that has been briefly mentioned, the impact of new technologies in the evolution of the sort of challenges or the sort of threats that we face, and of the response that they require, not least then further on in terms of requirements, in terms of capabilities. We'll discuss all that, but first, Tomáš, very much the floor to you for your own tour d'horizon and assessment of this strategic landscape and threat assessment.
Many thanks, and I do hope we come back to the technology issue. There's a couple of topics there that we don't discuss enough, and we should. But let me first join Gustav and Sandy in thanking both the U.S. mission and EPC for putting on this event. And it's not just a formality. We ought to be having these conversations more often because, as Sandy says, and I agree, the threat environment hasn't changed all that greatly, and we Europeans and Americans see by and large the world through the same eyes. But what has changed, what we Europeans have lately found unnerving, and let's move straight into towards the elephant in the room, is the new emphasis in the United States on the competitive nature of the international order, as opposed to the cooperative nature which we Europeans not just like to stress, because it sounds like, it's a hobby horse that we have found some time ago, and we now insist on. It's not even a European invention in many ways. The cooperative interdependence is a US invention, and people like Andrew Carnegie, whose institution where I work for, were more prominent than any Europeans at the time in bringing it about. But the new emphasis, whether it's in the writing of the now departed National Security Advisor McMaster, whether it's in the deeds, in the actual withdrawal from the Paris Accord, from the JCPOA, the new emphasis on competitive nature of international relations as opposed to the cooperative approach through institutions and agreements, that unnerves us. It has sort of a fourfold effect on Europe, and I want to put out those issues on the table briefly. Perhaps we can come back to them in the Q&A. I mean, the first effect that it has is that it makes us worry, and perhaps this is entirely unjustified. I look forward to hearing from our U.S. friends on the subject. But it does make us worry that we're moving from, what you might term sort of a stable equilibrium in the world to an unstable one. In the sense that once you remove the moderating power of the treaties, of the agreements, once you normalize certain types of behavior, once you once the United States in particular stops intervening and stops having intervening, meaning in a sense of getting countries in the Middle East and elsewhere to moderate their behavior. Once you stop seeing that sort of a moderating role, once you stop seeing that, once you start seeing on the U.S. part that it's accepted and it's become a part of a daily routine that, you know, we live in a competitive environment to let things play themselves out, that means in the future, potentially, that, you know, future flashpoints will be allowed to burn out of control, whereas in the past, the United States, with us or alone, would have intervened to prevent things from getting necessarily worse. So the first impact that it has on us, seen from European security perspective, is that we worry that we're about to enter a period of potentially more conflicts because flashpoints that would have previously been extinguished will not be now. The second impact is that it makes it more difficult internally in Europe to make the case for continued strong security and defense relationship with the United States. Let me, before anybody jumps in, make the obvious point. There's an incredibly strong body of evidence that the United States, if anything, has redoubled, in fact, by some measures, quintupled its investment into European defense. The European, precisely, in money terms alone, in terms of troops, there's obviously an enormous body of evidence to suggest that, if anything, U.S. investment in European defense has gone up exponentially. Equally, as Sandy will understand the European politics better than anybody else, having been in charge of the relationship with a number of countries, but including with the EU at the Pentagon, and then, of course, many years at NATO. Equally, the sort of philosophical departure on the issue of cooperative versus competitive environment will make it easier for those of us in Europe who have always had a preference for a sort of softer relationship with the United States, to make their point, to build the argument, look, we don't see the world through the same eyes. Perhaps we are closer to China on trade than to the United States. Perhaps, there's other alternatives. So that worries me. I suspect, again, the new emphasis on competitive nature of the world as opposed to cooperative will make it more difficult for the Atlanticist in Europe to be effective. Thirdly, and I've already hinted at that, my second to last point, Gustav. Sorry, Giovanni. Thirdly, the renewed emphasis on the competitive nature of the international environment will make it easier for some of us in Europe to make the argument for accommodation with third parties, whether it's Russia or others. The argument will be easier to make now that, again, on trade issues, maybe we find ourselves closer in line with China than we do with the United States. Perhaps on Iran, Russia is and maybe even China is the true friend, not the United States. So I worry about the accommodationist tendencies rearing their ugly head. And lastly, this is sort of an intra-European point, but worth making. It adds more fuel to the fire to confuse my metaphors, to the tensions between Central and Western European countries. For a number of reasons, I'm happy to go into the further questions and answers. The Central Europeans, and Northern Europeans too, by the way, for good reasons of geography and history, consider the close defense relationship with the United States far more existential to their own defense needs, and will therefore be far more reluctant to go into a confrontation or in sort of an intellectual departure from the United States, which is going to now put them at odds with many of the West Europeans who will see in Iran, in the Paris Agreement, see more evidence that perhaps we ought to go our own way. And that's just going to add to what is already a relationship in Europe between Central and the West that's crackling with tension on migration, on posted workers directives, and so forth. So at the risk of having overloaded the agenda, I wanted to put those four points on the table for us to pick up.
I think that's very interesting. I think, Ambassador, you want to come in?
Tomáš raises a lot of good points. It's somewhat ironic that the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, which were put out by the administration at the end of last year, they do indeed talk about long-term strategic competition, but they focus on a competition with Russia and China, a revisionist Russia and a revisionist China. And they don't talk about a more competitive relationship with our own allies. Indeed, the documents at least stress the critical importance of alliances, which was seen in some ways as a veering back towards the mainstream and away from President Trump's own early emphasis on terrorism as being more of a threat than Russia, and also sort of treating traditional allies as freeloaders and ingrates whom we shouldn't defend unless they start paying up much more in terms of their defense spending.
We'll come to the sort of the debate about capabilities, investment, and burden sharing between Europe and the US in the context of the alliance. But if I may go back to the sort of landscape that you have sketched out, because here there are, shall we say, three dimensions of defense policy and defense affairs. There is the question of instability around Europe, and therefore the demand for a capacity for projecting force, for foreign interventions, for expeditionary missions, for a variety of reasons, which has been there in the past, and considering instability may continue to be there. There is the question of collective defense, of territorial defense, which is back on the table, and there is the question of the so-called hybrid threats. Now, these issues are connected in many ways, Gustav pointed out, and I think that one of the dimensions that brings them together is the impact of the technology revolution in shaping the discussion on defense, in shaping the discussion on military affairs, on offensive, defensive capabilities, on deterrence, in Europe and, of course, beyond, in other theaters. But looking at the European situation and in the light of this evolving nature of the agenda, including the applications of new technologies, there are domains of competition and potential warfare which are by now entirely acknowledged. The cyber domain, for example, expanding the scope of competition, but there are other dimensions, other aspects of the technology revolution. There is artificial intelligence, robotics, even biotechnologies. So how can we make sense of this variety of issues and of the fast-changing nature of these applications and implications, therefore, for military affairs through a strategic approach? Because strategy is about aligning ends and means. It is about setting your priorities, what is most important, where do we really have to look at, what should preoccupy us the most, where do we have to invest resources, research, money, where do we have to prioritize? So if I could turn to the question from the kind of assessment that we had, to the question of priorities, where do you see we should really focus? Where do you think our efforts should be concentrated? I appreciate that, of course, it cannot entirely be a question of either or. There is a need probably to look at ways to cope with this variety of challenges. But if you were to set priorities, to make this sort of strategic effort of priority setting with a view to developing the adequate capabilities that we need, what would be your agenda? Perhaps in this case, Tomáš, do you want to start?
Let me focus on the role of technologies and what would I do in terms of capabilities to better adjust to the threat environment. Let me make the obvious, start with the obvious point. Technologies don't exist in a separate universe apart from our daily lives. Just as war is a continuation of politics by other means, technology, everything you mentioned, you could have mentioned automated warfare and so forth, is simply another means by which we'll continue for doing foreign affairs business and war. The impact, I see two kinds of impact and require two kinds of adjustments that I want to highlight. One, we don't pay enough attention to the vulnerabilities, the existing vulnerabilities and growing vulnerabilities of our critical civilian infrastructure to cyber attacks. The sort of things that make our trains run on time and on tracks as opposed to hurtling in a field at 300 kilometers an hour. The sort of things that make our healthcare work and that we count on when a doctor these days remotely orders an insulin drip to a patient, we assume that the medicine will be administered in the right doses at the right time. These sort of things that we take for granted, they're all vulnerable. What happened, I'm not going to bore you with the technological details, but these systems used to be either completely manual, and if they were automated, they were run on these obscure proprietary pieces of software that nobody ever bothered to hack. There was really no point. It was complicated. These days, they have all become automated. They run basically by and large on the same software that runs your corporate networks or your home computers. Therefore, they've become much easier to penetrate on scale, en masse. And if you need a warning, read the recent combined and really unprecedented US-UK report warning on of the probing, and they've actually named Russia. The Russian state agents are conducting on a daily basis, looking for weaknesses in our infrastructure, planting software to be used in a critical situation. How will this be used? Why does this matter? What does healthcare and transportation have to do with the things we talk about, security of Europe? Simple. Fast forward to a situation, or imagine a situation where a crisis happens someplace in Europe, and either the EU or NATO or a combination thereof is mobilizing for action because a collective decisive movement from all 29, 28, 27, whatever it is required. At that very point, our adversaries would be thinking, how do I stop this machinery from kicking into motion? How do I divide the 29, the 27 or the 28 so that it isn't the collective mass of the EU or NATO that comes down bearing on me? And they will be thinking, I have a card to play. If I threaten a disruptive and potentially a devastating attack on the country's healthcare, transportation, energy distribution system, I will present those governments with a terrible dilemma. Do I go to the help of an ally in southern, eastern Europe, northern Europe, wherever the flashpoint is, and risk that people beat themselves to death in the streets with baguettes or because there isn't enough water and ATMs, cash machines, stop dispensing cash? Or do I opt for to preserve peace and stability at home at the risk of reneging on Article 5 or other commitments, and therefore dealing a potentially fatal blow to these institutions? We have, in other words, handed through the automation of some of our critical systems a powerful card to the adversaries, the importance of which we have yet to fully appreciate. Now, NATO, in large part under Sandy's guidance and thanks to his good efforts, and through a lot of efforts of individual countries, the United States first and foremost, has made enormous strides in recognizing the importance of cyber vulnerabilities, but it hasn't gone quite far enough. It has accepted that the network and the military networks need to be protected and has made enormous strides in hardening those, investing into that. We haven't quite made the leap into the civilian networks. My last point, this is an obvious area for greater cooperation between NATO and the EU. At the end of the day, the alliance is not in a position to tell governments how to look after their healthcare systems, how to look after their transportation systems. It is not in a position to write legislation. The EU is potentially, when it comes to criminalizing negligence, when it comes to protecting civilian critical infrastructure. Those are the sort of things the EU could possibly do, not NATO. So I said I will put two threads out there. I won't because I was far too long on the first one. I hope we get to automated warfare later on, but I wanted to put at least this one issue out there.
Thank you very much, Tomáš. The role of the EU, the approach of the EU to cyber challenges, but also more broadly to this sort of evolving security agenda was brought up. The EU has actually adopted some measures, recent communication on security of networks and information, has been conducting training, has been conducting exercises. Alongside NATO. This is, by the way, one of the issues that are at the core of NATO-EU cooperation since the Warsaw Declaration, since the action points adopted in late 2016 and then again in late 2017. So, Gustav, how do you see this evolving agenda and the role of the European Union in particular in dealing with it?
Okay, so just a couple of points, and the first one, of course, is to underline that with so many issues and challenges out there, to prioritize them is critical, but also I'm sure that if we had a poll here, we would have very different answers to what are the top 5 issues that we need to deal with. So maybe another way to look at it is what is it really that we care about? And I think that for most of us here, and maybe those watching online, A lot of it is about really ensuring that the system that we have in place, so the liberal order, international order, that is something that we care about. We want to have the ability to have free, open communication, trade, things of this nature. So that is kind of the end state. And then we have to understand what are the things that we need to ensure are in place to allow for that end state. It could be physical security, it could be environmental security, it could be the security of our critical infrastructures and networks and services. And I think that that is a good way of trying to grapple with these issues. And for the EU, of course, the toolbox is very wide, so it has to consider all kinds of instruments and tools, both military and mainly civilian, to try to address many of these challenges. Maybe one good thing to do, and this would be my second point, is the importance to have some kind of a framework that complements our thinking when we try to address many of these challenges, i.e., what are some of the issues that we feel would have the biggest consequences? Some people like to think about what are the kinds of issues that might lead to the most casualties or deaths. And here they might say that a nuclear engagement would be the key issue to focus on. Others might be much more focused on disruptions to societies, and that is something even more worrisome. And depending on how you move, combined with some kind of ability to think in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, so that you can also look at issues that will come in the horizon, I think that is quite helpful when we try to prioritize. I would also like to give maybe 1 or 2 points on the issues of technology. That is an enabler to societies. It's something very good for us. It's good for economic development, innovation, communications. But there's also an underside. And I think that some of the issues that we even call emerging, such as cyber, I would argue already emerged a long time ago. But what we see today is a re-emergence of issues having to do with cyber. And clearly one of them that we haven't focused enough on is the emergence of the Internet of Things, which is that more and more things are being connected to the Internet. Many of these things connected have very limited security protocols. We have seen estimates of 50 billion things connected to the Internet by 2020. Sorry. And of course, this means that if we don't have a good strategy in place with good protocols, we may face very, very strong vulnerabilities that were already covered before. And why is this important? It's important because we're moving towards smart cities, the smart grid, smart transportation. So our society will become increasingly vulnerable, and we need to recognize this. I think one of the key issues that we need to ensure that we keep on the agenda is also the governance of some of these new developments. And I think here AI, artificial intelligence, is going to be one of those issues that if we do our thinking early on, we may avoid a lot of headache further down the line. So the governance of AI, how will that be done most effectively? Who should be involved in this? Is this the multi-stakeholder approach? And I would believe here that the EU and the US would be keen on having a form of a multi-stakeholder approach, i.e. the public, private, and civil society sectors having a say on how we try to govern some of these new technologies, without, of course, stifling their potential. So I think there are lots of things that we can look at further down the line. But it's not just the cyber. I think that we can talk about nanotechnology, biotechnology, 3D printing. That's going to revolutionize also how we function in the future. And there's a lot of potential for good, but also a lot of potential for bad. And maybe the final point, this will be my final point, is we also need to remember that a lot of the capabilities that we have today for positioning and navigation and timing, they're based on our space assets, and these are vulnerable as well. So things such as Galileo, GPS, we need to pay attention to things such as the addition of space junk that is going to perhaps make it more difficult to have certain services like Earth observation. We need to be careful if some countries can use asymmetric means to enhance the amount of debris in space. So we also need to make sure that these systems cannot be hacked in any way, shape, or form. So there are a lot of things. So there's no limit on issues. Maybe that's the point. It's very hard to prioritize, but the more we can think early in a systematic way, collaboratively, the better for all of us.
So a capacity for anticipation,
yes.
A sort of strategic early warning of what could be the implications, the medium and long-term implications of technologies that have emerged or are emerging. And of course, you and Tomáš have referred to a number of issues. You have also mentioned, I think, an important word, that is the governance of these new technologies and their implications across the board, including potential military implications. And if I'm not mistaken, here we detect a serious deficit of governance and absence of governance. The flip side of that could be the risk of growing armament competition, if not race, in developing ever more lethal and threatening applications of these technologies. And so, perhaps, Ambassador Vershbow, how do you see the seriousness of the threats that these technologies can pose, and how do you see the response, in particular on the Nato side, to deal with this agenda?
Yeah. Well, I agree with my colleagues that lots of these marvelous new technologies that are going to improve our lives and make life more enjoyable also create all kinds of vulnerabilities that we're going to have to deal with. But I think from the NATO perspective, we also have to look at the advances in military technology that the Russians are introducing that are beginning to erode, if not eliminate, the historic advantage that the United States and NATO have had. And we have to invest in the new technologies so that we can stay one step ahead and offset some of the Russian advances in precision strike, in the use of cyber threats, and they will be incorporating artificial intelligence and some of the new exotic weaponry. So NATO needs to think about all these broad challenges to our society, but I think where NATO's responsibility is first and foremost is in ensuring that our nations are investing in the essential technologies that will enable us to maintain deterrence, the ability to deter conventional attack, but also think about the impact of cyber on military operations. And as Tomáš said, we have to harden our own cyber systems so that we can continue to operate in a cyber environment. We've also begun to push the envelope in thinking about, what is the meaning of Article 5 in the event of cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure that could inflict mass casualties, cause social disruptions far greater than conventional attacks in some scenarios. So this too is a challenge for the alliance, both in terms of technology and in military doctrine and strategy, how to adapt to these kinds of asymmetric threats, which could be as lethal as more classic threats. At the same time, the threats to our societies, I think I agree that this is an area where NATO and the EU need to collaborate, because NATO's toolkit and its mandate perhaps doesn't go as far as the EU's in dealing with the implications of all these different technologies and hybrid threats for social stability. And the whole field of resilience, I think, is a natural area where NATO and the EU have begun to work together, but have only scratched the surface of finding some of the solutions. When you think of what the Russians have been doing in terms of interference in our political systems, using relatively simple techniques, using bots and fake accounts on Facebook and Twitter to exploit social divisions in our societies, or more classic means of direct support for radical political parties. We have to look at the low-tech as well as the high-tech threats that can all add up to a major threat to the stability and the viability of our democratic systems. It's leading, the debate in the United States is pointing to, let's reintroduce paper ballots, because we can't count on the security of all the sophisticated election machinery and in light of what the Russians have demonstrated in our 2016 election. This may just be the beginning. So NATO, I think, as I said, should be focusing first and foremost on defense, countering the military progress of Russian technology, but also has a role to play working with the EU and with member states in these issues that affect social cohesion and stability.
Thank you very much. So it seems that there is a, let's say, from my standpoint at least, there is certainly a growing awareness of the range of threats and challenges that Europe is facing. There is also certain unease with the acknowledgement of a more competitive international environment and of some of the vulnerabilities that our countries are facing, and the range of vulnerabilities very much cutting across internal and external policies and different policy areas, including very much civilian infrastructure, digital infrastructure, has just been sketched out very well. And because of this heightened sense of a more difficult and a more challenging security context, I think there has also been a shift, a development in the debate at the EU level on Europe's defense cooperation, on the need to join forces among member states to develop capabilities, and to set in motion to sort of change gear in the European EU defense agenda to strengthen cooperation. There has been the EU Global Strategy, there have been initiatives by the European Commission, there is, as we know, PESCO on the table, there is the prospect of the European Defence Fund, so there is an evolving agenda. At the same time, there is an evolving agenda about cooperation between NATO and the European Union. As I mentioned, since 2016, of course, a focus on hybrid threats, focus on exchange of information and assessments, a focus on including maritime and naval security and cooperation, sort of cooperation on exercises, and so an evolution in that direction. And clearly, there has been a lot happening on the NATO side, since Wales, on to Warsaw, and a summit coming up now in July, and the evolution from reassurance to deterrence, the sort of shifting force posture to the east, enhanced presence, not to speak of the other issues on the agenda, such as cyber security. So before turning to the floor, perhaps I'd like to conclude this round of exchanges with asking the panel for their sense of the relevance, the importance of these developments, what is new on the agenda of the EU and NATO on the agenda of their cooperation when it comes to dealing with Europe's security and defense. What can we expect in the years to come? Gustav, perhaps you want to start.
Well, thank you, Giovanni, and I think you already outlined some of the things that are on the EU's agenda. Of course, it is important to underline that the EU has taken very proactive steps now to try to use its tools effectively, and I think the permanent structured cooperation is an example of this. Some argue that this is something that has been tried before, but this time there is a very strong, it's a very inclusive instrument. It has, it's the first time you actually have to perform. I mean, there's a review mechanism. It's binding. So this is very welcome. And of course, there are other tools that will be supportive of PESCO. You mentioned the European Defence Fund, which will enable many of the projects. We have 17 initial projects. There will be more on things such as having a European medical command, enhancing military mobility. So there's a lot of examples coming up now. And we also have a system now that's being introduced for having a coordinated annual review. So hopefully these tools will find synergies, and that's the objective, and they will enable the EU to use those precious resources even more effectively. And it will take a little bit of time, so that is also important to recognize that even though there might be very high expectations now for very immediate results, I think it would be important to recognize that it takes a little bit of time. And also there are many other things happening now within the EU. There are discussions on the multi-annual financial framework, how funding will be spent. So 2019 will be, of course, an interesting year with parliamentary elections, a new commission. So there are a lot of things happening, Brexit. So let's not forget that. But maybe final point, very pleased to see also the collaboration with NATO to have taken this giant step forward with the agreement now, with the joint declaration, and with the specific action points, the 42 points, and this strong emphasis then on hybrid issues. So we'll see now in July how the discussions move forward, how much emphasis there are on things such as burden sharing. And maybe my final point will be precisely on burden sharing, to say that that can take many different forms. And of course, one form is we can focus on 2% and how we move towards 2% by 2024 within NATO, the defense investment pledge. But there are also other ways in which we can see important contributions, and I think contributions to official development assistance, for example, where the EU, together with the EU member states, tends to be the biggest contributor, 75.7 billion euros last year. So we have to recognize that there are different ways to contribute to this very broad security landscape. But I'm hopeful that there will be continued constructive engagement across the transatlantic to deal with these issues.
Thank you very much, Gustav. Ambassador Vershbow, how do you see this agenda?
Well, I see it as a potentially promising one. I've always been sort of more open-minded than some Americans on European defense and the value of having the EU having a capacity to take the lead in some scenarios, as it already has been doing, particularly in Africa. For the administration, of course, the big focus these days is on burden sharing, and President Trump, I think rightfully, has said that the gap in spending between Europe and the United States has gotten unacceptably wide. And he's focused on the 2% of GDP benchmark, but I think there's an effort underway to kind of broaden the criteria for evaluating whether allies are doing more to shoulder the burdens of the common defense. So PESCO and the European Defense Fund, I think, could be helpful as catalysts or giving more impetus to European efforts to produce the right capabilities that would benefit NATO and benefit the European Union. But they have to avoid some of the mistakes that have been made in the past, which has been sort of to define European requirements separately from the NATO defense planning process, which I think can lead to needless duplication, even competition for resources. I think today it's clear that anything that the EU can do to produce capabilities that will fill some of the gaps that NATO has been worried about for several years, including more airlift, ISR, aerial refueling capacity, deployable command and control, and logistics. This will be a win-win. It will ensure that we have more of a capacity to carry out our collective defense missions and to bring reinforcements to the eastern flank in a crisis. But at the same time, it'll increase the deployability of European forces to do CSDP operations. So it is a potential win-win, and I hope that this time around there will be more. The EU will take advantage of the new mechanisms that are developing between NATO and the EU to avoid duplication, align what the European Union is doing as much as possible with the NATO defense planning process and the capability goals that are set forth there, and also avoid an overly restrictive approach to defense industry cooperation. This is a sensitive point with the Trump administration, worried that American companies, even who have European subsidiaries, may not be able to at least partner with European companies in carrying out some of the projects being pursued under PESCO. I think there's one particularly promising initiative already sort of gaining traction under the PESCO banner, which is on military mobility. This has been recognized by NATO commanders as a major weak point in our capacity to reinforce the Baltic states or Poland in a crisis scenario. The various obstacles, both procedural, legal, and bureaucratic, and in terms of physical infrastructure, in getting large reinforcements across Europe quickly enough to save the day in a threatening environment. I think it's under the Dutch sponsorship, there's a project to, within the EU, to address at least some of the infrastructure gaps that would impede NATO reinforcement, but in particular to get at the legal and judicial impediments to the rapid movement across borders of military forces and materiel. So that would be a good success story on which to start with PESCO, and then we can move on to some of the cooperative procurement projects that are, I think, going to take longer to develop.
And there is a communication by the European Commission, an action plan on the European Commission on these matters, and also a proposal to allocate significant budget to develop transport infrastructures and to upgrade transport infrastructure to support military mobility. Tomáš, EU agenda evolving, NATO agenda evolving. How do you see them evolving? What, by the way, also in the run-up to the summit, to the NATO summit in July. And then I'm aware that we need to briefly step backwards for you to look forward on the point on automated warfare that you wanted to raise before. And so I'm happy to give you the floor for comments on that too, to conclude this round of discussion and then open for a debate with the floor.
I'll save automated warfare for later, because this is an interesting subject that you have opened and that Gustav and Sandy spoke to. So where do EU's defense responsibilities end and NATO's begin, and vice versa? And it's a subject of frankly, as Sandy has alluded to it, some US-European confusions. So let me offer a simple thought on it. What's been difficult to appreciate when you're looking at EU defense policy writ large, the ambitions we set for ourselves, the documents we write, the procurement decisions we make, the industrial decisions we make. What has been difficult for non-Europeans, not just Americans, to understand is that we're not just making defense policy, we're also making European policy. We're pursuing 4 different objectives in drafting our defense, making our defense decisions. Like the United States, we begin by asking what are sort of the EU's values and interests that we need to defend, what do we hold dear, what are the threats. Like the United States, industrial elements play an important role. In the United States, the Congress annually rewrites the White House submission, the budget submission, with an eye on protecting jobs. We do the same thing. Let's be honest, that's why we see elements in PESCO, EDF, elsewhere, that both send more money in the direction of the European defense industry and shelter it from competition, mainly from US companies. Unlike the United States, we Europeans have 2 other factors that come into what shapes our defense thinking. First, we think of defense, we regard defense as yet another area of European integration where it's important to make progress for the sake of keeping the EU strong, whole, and healthy. I don't want to diminish that factor or that impulse at all. It's an important part of pushing back against the growing perception that EU is in trouble and therefore perhaps replaceable. But it's often hard for non-Europeans to understand that when we say that PESCO is the greatest single leap in decades, even though in defense terms it doesn't really make that much difference, we actually mean it, because it was actually hugely important. Because at a time of a real malaise and crisis in Europe, the European governments rallied and produced a movement forward on defense, that mattered in stopping the momentum of the anti-European populist forces. And that's often hard to appreciate from outside Europe. To us, defense could be defense today, digital economy tomorrow, is also seen as through the prism of, is this helping the EU look better, healthier? Is it making it more popular? And lastly, let's be honest, there's a school of thought in Europe that holds that the business of European integration is incomplete as long as the United States is ultimately in charge of European defense. So, when you read carefully and parse the documents, whether it's the global strategy, whether it's the PESCO notification, you find shout-outs, dog whistle calls to those in Europe who believe in autonomy in a sense of actual EU and Europe taking over the responsibilities that NATO currently plays. So that's what makes it so complicated often to understand from outside Europe, that what is it that drives European defense policies is not just the usual interest and values and industry. It's also the autonomous argument and the institutional argument, the integrationist argument. My simple advice, talking point to my American friends is begin by assuming that, again, it's a far more, when we talk about European defense, it's a far more complicated process. There's far many more factors enter into the equation than would be the case in setting US defenses. It's not just about values and interests and industry. To us, it's also about distancing ourselves. For some of us in Europe, that's the case. It's also about making the whole European enterprise look healthier and more successful. And realize that this is a project in which has at least 4 different objectives. They compete with each other. That's why you will find in stated objective of better value for money, producing more defense equipment for less money, which is what the stated objective of EDF and some of the other initiative is, at odds with the protectionist measures for European defense industry. Because when you take it to the logic, any measure that protects, shelters European procurement from US sellers essentially moves the market more in the direction of a seller's market, which is going to drive up the per unit cost of defense equipment. So you'll find that those 4 different factors often work at cross purposes. Assume, which I feel strongly, the European defense is here to stay. It's now an important part of the DNA of the European Union. The European defense policy is not something that can be like toothpaste put back in a tube, and work with us. Work with the like-minded countries to emphasize the importance of retaining focus on values and interests, because that's where there is a huge overlap between the United States and Europe. Accept that on industry, this will be a zero-sum game. The United States has the same view of European suppliers, so let's accept that on that particular dossier, we will have tensions that we will need to manage. Accept that on the issue of autonomy, not a universally shared view in Europe, but it is an important school of thought in Europe. There, obviously, there will be a plain zero-sum relationship between the Atlanticists and the autonomists. And accept that on the integration front, the steps we make towards European defense, which are primarily serving the cause of advancing European integration, sometimes will seem as a distraction to you. But to the extent that they keep the European project healthy and alive, it's actually a boon for the broader transatlantic interest.
Thank you, Tomáš. I think that you have sketched out many of the variables that come into play in the debate on European defense and the role of the EU and the new projects and drivers. I think that in this context, clearly the question of complementarity and synergy in between different aspects is stated over and over again. And it seems to me that the extent to which we will manage to move forward in ways that are mutually reinforcing across Europe and US and across the EU and NATO is probably the core of the issue, what is really driving and focusing minds. The degree of autonomy that Europeans are seeking to achieve, I think, also applies very much to what has been an expectation and an encouragement, not least on the part of the US, to be able to undertake stronger responsibilities for their security and defense on their own, if and when the US is not engaged. So there are many variables and clearly many readings and many approaches to these situations, but it seems to me that the underlying theme of complementarity and advancing on sort of compatible agendas, avoiding duplications and so on and so forth, is a theme that is very largely shared. But this is yet another issue for the debate that now I'm going to open with the floor. And I see already 2 questions, 3 and 4. I take these 4 to start with, and then we'll move on as time comes. Please. You have a microphone in your armrest, left or right, I don't remember. And please identify yourself and you ask your question and specify if you're addressing it to a particular member of the panel. It's better with a mic. It's just beside you.
Streaming.
Does it work?
It does.
Okay, I hope it works. My name is Vladimir Kuk. I'm Deputy Head of Moldovan Mission to EU. Thank you very much for very thought-provoking beginning of and your statements. I was quite surprised not to hear one word in this initial debate. It's Brexit. And just a couple of days ago, or beginning of May, the UK laid out its views. How do they see the security cooperation with European partners post-Brexit? There were some replies from you. Mr. Lindstrom just chaired a very important panel a couple of days ago. So may I ask the panel their view on on the way UK sees security cooperation after Brexit, and how was at this point EU response? Is it complementary? Is it enough? Are they matching the expectation of each other, or there is still a big gap in views how the security might look like after Brexit? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lady, please.
Hello, is it working? Yes. My name is Alice Stolmeyer. I'm working for Defending Democracy. By now, Russia has interfered in several of our elections and is widely expected to continue to do so. Should there be a joint response? And if so, what should it look like? It's a question for all of you.
Thank you very much. We have a question over here.
Is that working?
Yes.
Yes. James Sher from Chatham House. I'm going to disappoint my colleague. My question is not about Brexit, it's about Russia. And I want to suggest that if the EU wants Russia's defense establishment to take EU defense seriously, I can think of no better way of doing that than bringing to fruition one issue you have been talking about, which is delivering on mobility of military assets across Europe, building that military Schengen system. And so I'd like to invite the panelists to be more specific about where we stand with this. I understand there is a project. Do we have headline goals? Do we have stages? Do we have deadlines? How specific, where are we with this? And thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Fraser.
Fraser Cameron at EPC. I think it was a slightly surreal discussion because, I mean, what was missing here, I thought, was public opinion. Politicians have to take decisions against the background of how the publics, and particularly the parliaments, view this relationship. And obviously, with regard to Trump, very controversial figure. Look at the debates about when and if he should even come to the UK and the huge demonstrations that could be inspected there. And if the Trump administration starts taking sanctions against European companies because of Iran in the coming weeks, it's going to sour relations much deeper. So do we really seriously think that in this atmosphere, we can really move the transatlantic agenda forward in the way you've all reasonably put forward in these different areas? And just to add a slight supplement to the lady on democracy, is there not a danger, because Andrew Parker identified, and I think James Sher would perhaps share the assessment of the Russian threat going beyond the military here. Is there not a danger of this serious threat falling through the gaps between NATO and the EU in terms of how we respond to it, in terms of defending our democracy across the board?
Thank you, Fraser. So, Brexit, interference in democratic elections and the sort of political life of our countries, related to the question on public opinion trends and their impact on the scope for transatlantic cooperation, and as part of the fledgling defense policy and projects and NATO-EU cooperation, the question again of military mobility and what progress can really be envisaged on that. So perhaps, Ambassador, would you like to start?
Okay. I'll say a little bit on each of the questions. Obviously, Brexit will lead to a reduction in the net military capability available to the EU, and I think that should create an incentive for the EU to find ways to expand opportunities for non-EU members to at least participate or engage in both planning and execution of EU-led operations. This has always been a sensitive issue because of reluctance to grant Turkey the kind of full partnership relationship with the EU that non-NATO EU members have had with NATO. But I think this is the time to sort of think more outside the box. Doesn't mean making them a voting member on all decisions relating to CSDP, but widening the opportunities for non-EU members in general, and the UK in particular, to continue to participate and contribute to EU-led operations. On mobility, I don't know exactly where things stand. I think there is a debate going on within the European Union on just how much, in terms of EU funds, should be expended on infrastructure projects that are largely beneficial to NATO military operations rather than to EU military operations. So I think that, I hope that that doesn't lead to sort of loss of momentum on this initiative, because I think that would miss the opportunity for the EU and NATO to kind of do something mutually reinforcing. But it may point to the need for NATO to have its own mobility initiative, which focuses on sort of the west to east corridors, and replacing or repairing bridges that are not adequate to allow large tank transports to move to the front. And the EU may be focusing on mobility from member states to ports of debarkation for out-of-area operations. But this still could be mutually beneficial, and hopefully the EU will think more broadly about this issue than I fear it may be doing right now. On these larger political questions, do we need a joint response to election interference? I think we need certainly to have more transatlantic discussion and coordination, exchange of assessments of what the methodology the Russians and other adversaries have been using to disrupt our democratic institutions, and exchange best practices. But I think at the end of the day, each member state is going to have to kind of come up with solutions specific to its own political system and the particular threats to which it's most vulnerable. But again, more transatlantic discussion and exchanging of experience could be beneficial. Fraser's more fundamental question is, I think, one that should worry us all. I think that the growing divergence between the two sides of the Atlantic on sort of many key issues, the Iran deal being the most recent one, makes it, as I know, sort of difficult, if not sort of toxic, for European publics to be doing things that seem to be yielding to Donald Trump's demands. But I think this is a case where people have to, as much as possible, compartmentalize, recognize that when it comes to the common defense and deterrence, we will not succeed unless we stay together. And I hope that the NATO agenda, which remains an area of cooperation, where the Trump administration, as I said at the beginning, has shown more continuity than on other transatlantic issues, will ensure that we kind of keep this issue as fenced off from some of the more problematic issues as we can.
Thank you very much. Tomáš.
Let me cherry pick a little bit, because if we all speak to all four issues, there'll be no time for a second round of questions. So I'll do two or three. On Brexit, thank you. Ironic that to take Vladimir from Moldova to ask the questions, but it was totally appropriate. What we tell ourselves is that we have made more progress on European defense over the last few months than, say, over the few preceding decades. But the real story is that if Britain becomes yet another third country, kind of like Macedonia but bigger, which doesn't join European operations by default, it does so sometimes and often with only a symbolic contribution, then Europe's capacity to look after its own values and interests will have actually decreased, even accounting for PESCO and everything else, and progress in the other areas over the last few years. The 2016 to 19 period may be remembered as a period of net decrease in Europe's capacity to look after its own values and interests if we get the defense portion of Brexit wrong. Now, I realize that I say so as a defense expert, therefore my incentives are not aligned, are not the same as, say, the chief EU negotiators. But the point I'm making is, if we are to play tactics with the defense portion of the post-Brexit arrangement, let's do so delicately and with care, because the risks of getting the Galileo deal wrong, but most importantly, the continued British contributions to European operations and missions, the risk of getting that wrong, risks to eclipse all the other progress we made in all the important areas, and I strongly believe that. On mobility, I don't have the specifics. I didn't actually know of the dichotomy of the potential divergence that Sandy sketched out. Europe focusing on ports of embarkation and NATO focusing on East-West. But the obvious drawback, and I'm sure you're aware of this, Sandy, I think it would be a crazy idea, and I hope we don't do that, because the obvious point to make is that mobility is not just, but it is by and large a question of money. It's going to take an awful lot of money to repair an awful lot of kilometers, miles, whatever you want it, of bridges, railways, platforms to actually make true mobility possible. The EU has the money, NATO doesn't. If we end up with the sort of division of labor you suggest, that means NATO may well end up with the best laid plans, but potentially little ability to guarantee the money for them. So I think that would be a disastrous decision. I'm not suggesting you're advocating it. In fact, I think you did the exact opposite.
That's where things are
precisely.
heading.
So we agree entirely on the subject. Lastly, Fraser's all-important point on public opinion. Yeah, I mean, it's more than the asterisk that hangs over all of the debates. It's really sort of the blanket that may make everything else we have sketched out impossible to execute. And Iran, in that regard, isn't just another or latest controversy. It's the perfect storm when you think about it, for a number of reasons. We Europeans think of the Iran deal as more than just another deal that was important in sort of Middle Eastern context. It's been seen, rightly, I think, as in some ways a touchstone success of European diplomacy. It's being seen in almost reverential terms. We've succeeded on Iran, a sign of maturation that we didn't necessarily show in Balkans and elsewhere. It's being seen as important, again, in European integration terms and in terms of building the EU project. So for the United States to now drop out of it, is being seen in some ways as not an attack. I mean, we're conscious this didn't enter the equation, but it's being seen in Europe as undermining something that we hold extremely dear. This isn't just another deal. This is the deal in many regards. First of all, second of all, we therefore, for the reasons I just laid out, and because the deal actually made sense, are going to try to uphold it and to try to work with Iran to convince it to stay in JCPOA or something like it. And the only way we Europeans can do so is by offering additional business investment incentives to Iran, because that is what Iran accepts. Except this promises to create the perfect storm on the US side. Because look at it from the US optics, right? The United States has just withdrawn from the agreement and is going to reimpose sanctions. And what do the Europeans do? They capitalize on sort of US principled position by upping their business with Iran. The way I suspect this will be spun by Fox News, I can write the headline right now, is sort of money-grabbing Europeans squeezing a business and squeezing profit out of US principled position. It's not true. The business, European-Iran business is trivial. We Europeans, if we manage to increase business with Iran, it will not be because it promises to make us richer. It's the actual impact is negligible. We will do so because it's the essential ingredient to keeping the deal alive. It is what Iran wants, and that's the only thing we can deliver. But the way this should be played out in the United States is going to be disastrous. If the United States is serious, and this is the big question that open question that I put to Sandy and other Americans in the room, if the withdrawal from JCPOA was simply a one-off, right? Just something that the president needed to do because there was a campaign promise, he fulfills his promises, plus it was an Obama thing, we don't like what Obama did. If in other words, this is the end of the process, then we might just get away, we Europeans and Americans, by having a mediocre crisis, right? We may, the Americans may not be all that exercised beyond the Fox News talking heads about increased European business with Iran. If, as I fear, the idea that we may now actually, the United States actually should engineer regime change in Iran through reimposition of sanctions and thereby imposition of economic hardship on Iran. If that idea really takes off, then we Europeans and Americans are in for a world of hurt, the likes of which we haven't seen, not even in 2003, because we Europeans are going to be seen in the United States as working at active cross purposes, in fact, actively undermining a stated US policy in Iran and profiting and benefiting in the process, which is going to be even worse than 2003, where we disagreed, but we kind of stayed out. In this particular case, we'll be seen in the US as actively working at cross purposes. The impact thereof on the feedback loop on European views of Trump, I don't need to play out. So let me simply end by playing out two other secondary consequences. The impact of European unity is going to be hugely detrimental. There isn't, Iran isn't an issue to all 28 countries alike. It's an issue to some countries far more so than others. So there'll be, let me put it delicately, different degrees of appetite for an open confrontation with the United States. But some countries like France may feel very strongly about the need to go in that direction. And even worse, my last point on this issue, again, this will be a perfect Central European, West European storm, because most of the countries that care about Iran deal are in the West. It's not that Central Europeans are against it, it's not as important to them. What is more important to them is closest to the United States, therefore are not going to go as far as France, Germany, and others in confronting the United States. Yet another ingredient to the brewing storm of Central and West European relations. So Fraser is right to point to the issue of public opinion. At the end of the day, we do what people in our situation, whether officials or defense analysts, can do, which is focus on the possible and hope to avoid the storm. But we ought to be conscious, as you rightly reminded us, there may well be a storm coming.
Thank you, Tomáš. Gustav.
Thank you, and I also try to be a bit telegraphic. On the Brexit discussions, of course, there's been quite a bit of not just discussions, but studies trying to understand the security implications of Brexit. We already have understood many of them, including the ability to lead a battle group, which is no longer possible. But I think now that we are starting to see all these implications, and as has been clear in some of the latest discussions, the key is to try to find a good working relationship. So it's really about what kind of mechanisms can we have to ensure that there's a good degree of collaboration, communication, exchange of information. And there have been many practical suggestions that this is one of the ways forward. But at the end of the day, we are in uncharted territory. So I think that the next few months, when we're looking more to political kind of wordings on how this relationship will be, is still a lot of open issues. So we shall see. But I think both sides are trying to find a way to ensure that there will be a good level of collaboration. I think that's an interest on both sides. With respect to the joint response to defense of elections and democracy, I think here I would agree with others that it will be very difficult to have a joint response, but I would hope that there is a sense of solidarity across the different countries that feel that this is a big issue for them. But I also do know that countries will come up with their own kind of responses. I think it's my understanding that, for example, in Finland, a very technologically advanced country, they will continue to have paper ballots precisely for this reason. So I believe that there will be different responses, but at least a good degree of solidarity, and also drawing attention to this is important across as many countries as possible, that they continue to say this is something that we're worried about, we don't appreciate this, and we don't think that this is very constructive. I think that already is quite good. With respect to military mobility, unfortunately, this is something that takes time, and I think that was mentioned that there have been indications that a lot of the infrastructure needs to be reinforced, widened, improved to facilitate the mobility. Not something that can be done quickly, and also, as mentioned before, within the PESCO project, the EDF funding currently is still not at the full level. So we are looking more at 2020 when the big financing mechanism will be available. So I think that there might still be a need for a bit more time and patience for this very important project. But things are moving forward, but slowly. That would be my understanding. And maybe the final point, I was very happy to hear what Tomáš said now about the fact that it is a very difficult situation where we are now when we see that across the Atlantic, while we have a similar view on what we want to see as the end state, i.e. in the case of Iran, we would like to see a more curtailed nuclear program that is more clear in what it wants to achieve. But we have differences with respect to the mechanisms, and that's one of the things that we cannot say does not exist. I mean, this is something that we're dealing with. It is making things more challenging, but hopefully, if we do agree on what we want as the end state, hopefully we can move around it. But right now, it is hard. It's difficult. And I think when we are linking now security objectives with trade objectives, it makes it even more difficult. And I'm going to be very curious to see some of these developments. My understanding, for example, to give one illustration of this, I think the Airbus agreement is for about 100 aircraft, is my understanding. Only a small portion of those have been delivered. I think less than 10, but don't quote me on this. Which means that the other ones are on hold. And of course, an Airbus aircraft has components from all over the place, including the United States. I don't know if the percentage is about 10%. So the question then is, what are the implications of that for Airbus now? So I think that there could be some very interesting kind of issues coming up in the next few days or weeks. And we may not be sure about what the outcomes of this will be. So I think that it will be very interesting to observe this. But there are many things coming up, so we shall see.
Very well. Interesting times. We have time for one, maximum two other questions and very quick replies from our panel so that we will manage to conclude the session by 11:15. Please, madam. You have to be quick now. Sure.
My name is Emily Fonseca.
If you could.
Very professional one. Voila, thank you. And I have a quick question on Chinese infrastructure. Is that viewed by anyone in the panel as a security threat to Europe? Buying up Chinese companies, buying airports, harbors, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. And final question over there.
Okay, it's working now. Thank you. Greg Christiansmeyer from the Commission of European Bishops' Conferences. And I'm quite interested in another dimension of defending Europe. The ambassador managed already to touch upon the question of resilience, and I would be very interested in how far human and society resilience could be touched by European Union and should be touched for addressing cyber attacks and issues like that, civil protection as kind of defending Europe. Thank you.
So the resilience agenda and the societal dimension of that, which we have addressed to some extent in our debate. Thank you for these questions. So very quick final comments on them. Perhaps you want to start, Gustav.
Okay, thank you. Again, I'll maybe just focus on the question by Emily with respect to Chinese infrastructures. Maybe to call it a threat is a strong word. I think what is more interesting, specifically from the EU perspective, is to continue to understand the initiatives. I mean, the One Belt, One Road, the implications of it, both the good, which it promises to have many good aspects to it. It will have some strategic aspects, and it may have some more challenging aspects. And to understand those is, of course, important. The EU is doing this. It's very keen to explore the connectivity issues associated with this. So this is ongoing work. But yes, I mean, it is important not to forget that when some countries are giving 99-year leases on port facilities that are of a specific size, that includes the ability to set up cement factories there as well, it can change a few things. And it's simply important to keep abreast of these issues in a neutral way, but try to understand the implications prior to labeling things. But to having a holistic kind of approach to it is essential. And this is happening at the moment. It's an ongoing issue, of course, but I'm glad you raised it because I think even more attention could be provided to this, this connectivity that is taking place across Asia towards Europe.
Politics of connectivity.
Yes.
Tomáš.
I'll leave resilience to Sandy because there was both his forte at NATO. He was also in charge of NATO EU. No, you're also in charge of NATO EU, so I'll leave the debate question on the EU to an American. And briefly address the Chinese thing by first of all, fully agreeing with Gustav. Chinese investments are such a sexy subject that excites imagination, and therefore it's hard to think clear-headed. The reality is, as Gustav says, there's a lot of investment that make an awful lot of sense to us. If China wants to rebuild highways and railway tracks in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, that's great for all of us, by all means. If China is taking exclusive leases or acquiring ownership of ports that are essentially, for example, for military mobility and other things, we obviously ought to think hard about whether that's a wise decision. We need A, more attention to it, and B, probably a Europe-wide mechanism for separating sort of the truly strategic from not, or at least a set of principles. Let me, in conclusion, say one last thing on the Chinese investments. They're also in headlines because of the suspicion that China is buying favors and is dividing EU countries. So this is not just a military question, it's also European foreign policy question. And the evidence for that, frankly, has been mixed. Yes, a number of, frankly, mostly Central European countries have played up the importance of Chinese investments because it serves their domestic political agenda of saying, oh, we have alternatives to the EU. That was particularly Viktor Orban's game, right? If we don't, if the EU doesn't like us, there's this option. It's never really meant seriously. They know exactly that the European investments dwarf by order of magnitude many times over anything that China has ever invested. So China is not a real alternative, nor is there really a neat reflection of that dependency or the relationship in the voting records. Countries in which China has invested very little are often voting with China and vice versa. So there's very little spillover effect from Chinese investments into the voting record in Europe on China.
Thank you, Tomáš. Alexander.
Yeah, briefly on China, I agree that we need to sort of look at specific acquisitions of infrastructure or investments under the One Belt, One Road initiative, sort of case by case, and see whether there are strategic implications which could affect our security in some cases, or whether there are political conditions attached that could have long-term geopolitical effects in terms of the orientation of countries in Central Asia or other areas where this initiative is likely to concentrate, and whether there will be a trend towards a deviation from WTO principles, whether this is going to undermine what's left of the principles of free trade, which China clearly has been violating in its relationship with my country, and should be a concern to everyone. On resilience, this is a big subject. I'm not an expert, but I think with the growing threats of cyber in terms of the ability to disrupt critical infrastructure, as well as the sort of the need to plan for the consequences of natural disasters, which could increase as extreme weather and other effects of climate change begin to become more significant. This is an area where I think NATO and EU countries need to work together to define a common approach to the problem and build those reserves of emergency stocks and other mitigating technologies that could enable us to avoid serious social disruption. This is part of deterrence. If an adversary, whether it's Russia or anybody else, is less able to succeed in using cyber or other asymmetric means to disrupt our societies, then they will be less likely to try to do so. That brings you back to also the election interference. The more that we can reduce our own vulnerabilities and deny the Russians the ability to succeed in the way they did with the manipulation of social media, for example, the less likely they will continue to invest in the Internet Research Agency and other tools of subversion that have been so much in the news of late. And I would say one more thing about, is this our chance to make final comments?
Quick one.
I have no.
Yeah, I think we need to kind of continue to work together as much as we can on the defense agenda, recognizing that we're going to have to agree to disagree on some issues where the Trump administration clearly is going to go its own way. But in the case of European defense, I think the focus I would recommend to my European friends is to focus on capabilities, on doing things, and less on the ideological aspects. I know this is important, as Tomáš said, in terms of making this part of the broader process of European integration. But sometimes there's too much talk about strategic autonomy, but not enough investment in the capabilities which would actually make strategic autonomy a real thing. Just remember when the French exercised their strategic autonomy and launched their intervention in Mali a few years ago. The first thing they did was call the Department of Defense and said, "Can you give us some airlift? Can you give us some ISR? We need refueling capabilities." And the Pentagon obliged and even gave a lot of that for free. But that doesn't add up to real strategic autonomy. So I think the key should be capabilities, the ability to field those capabilities and use them. EU battle groups have never been used, even though they exist. So I think the more this is about real action, real capacity to intervene, it will be seen as a win-win because it will take some of the burdens off the United States and off of NATO, who have plenty of other challenges to deal with, particularly since 2014.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time. I think that you pointed to what is very, very much the principal direction of the defense debate in Europe today, that is pooling forces and creating incentives to develop and achieve the capabilities that we need. That is a debate where we see something moving, although inevitably, probably, it will take, as Gustav mentioned, some time. So we have covered, obviously, a lot of ground. We have sketched out what is perceived to be a more contested and competitive, in fact, international system, and the difficulties, the unease that creates, in particular in Europe, but also the fact that there is awareness in Europe of the need to foster and enhance security and defense policies, cooperation between the EU and NATO advancing, respective agendas moving forward against the background of a political context where there are areas of agreements and areas of disagreements, and therefore also the potential consequences of that for the overall ability to move forward together. These are some of the issues that we have been discussed with excellent contributions by our panelists that we would like to thank very, very much for their insights, and which we will continue to discuss in the course of the day, looking at questions of terrorism and radicalization, and at some of the challenges that we meet in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe and relations with Russia. So we have a long day and a long set of discussions in front of us. Let me start by thanking the Alexander Vershbow, Tomáš Valášek, and Gustav Lindstrom for sharing their views with us today. Thank you. Coffee outside.